Michael Schaefer, Ross Johnson, Matt Schultz, and Landon Fry are all here this evening.
Free.
I've been back and
I'm just gonna say it. I've been thinking it for 10 minutes. I don't want a podcast scared.
Oh yeah.
ashes. Now I've seen the road.
Pregnancy is a beautiful thing. Pregnancy is a gift.
Oh, there are stories to tell.
What kind of paint sticks to asteroids? Like, if you don't prime your wall.
Afraid some days, but the road will lead us to a better place.
We are called to emerge from that default setting of self-involvement.
This is the great speech, the big speech. We are the speech guys, and we're talking about the 1940s today. We have a conclusion, perhaps a wrap up of some themes we've done around World War II, and ending with not a general or the true top leader of a free world allied country. But we're talking about Henry Wallace, Henry Agard Wallace. With us today, we have Matt, Mike, and Ross. How's everyone doing?
Hello. Glad to be here. Be here.
Great to be here, Landon.
Living the dream, boys.
I would be curious, when I sent it over, did anyone have any clue who Henry Wallace was?
No.
Didn't even nothing. I had nothing.
And then after reading about him, we do share some notes and do some background reading here. Initial thoughts, just one word before we get into it. What do you think of him and the topic we're about to discuss?
I got 3 words that sums him up pretty quickly.
He asked for one word.
No, 3's fine.
Farmer. No, 4 words. Farmer, first Bernie Sanders.
That's pretty fair.
Like 4 words.
My word.
I changed it then.
My word. After a brief glance looking at him, I would say impressed. I was impressed.
Impressed. Do you say that about Bernie Sanders as well?
We'll get there.
All right, 2 on the nose. Matt?
Gosh, I don't know. There's so many. He's a very complex. I'll say complex. Yeah, complex. There's a lot going on here.
Yeah.
Hey,
Truly.
Landon, I got a fuller answer for you if you want to use this as like the real response for this question. When I was reading about him, the first person that sort of came to mind was less Bernie Sanders, and I'd say more of like a Thomas Jefferson.
Yeah. No, he is.
Riffing us, very, very much a Renaissance man from agriculture. You know, he owned his own very successful agriculture seed business, learned calculus in order to understand hog prices better, and obviously did more than just dabble in the major social justice issues of the time, most significantly women's working rights and civil rights issues pertaining to African Americans.
Yeah,
So,
I couldn't have said it.
of course,
better
other
myself.
things as well, but yeah.
Basically, he was the 20th century TJ, essentially. And yeah, it was probably like ahead of his time, just taking like cross-disciplinary subjects and, I don't know, thinking very deeply and having a podium at which to express and like disperse a lot of his critical ideas.
I feel like we're talking around him a lot.
Deeply. And anyone
Go ahead, Matt. You said we're talking around him a lot.
I feel like we're talking around him a lot. Like we're saying good things, true things about him, but like do we have, I don't know. I feel like a succinct biography of sorts might be good for the listeners to just get some context for who he is and why he's important.
Yeah, let me see if I can do it in as quickly as possible. First, I myself didn't know who this guy was until about 3 years ago. My tech startup was acquired by DuPont Pioneer, one of the major agriculture firms in the world. Naturally, I'm like, all right, what is the history and the background of this company? I stumble upon Henry Wallace. He founded the company in the 1920s. It became one of the largest ag seed corn seed production um, supply chains for farmers. And he was one of the most powerful USDA ag secretaries we've ever had. And he was Roosevelt's vice president from 41 to 44, which was a pretty critical time in America. And he should have been Roosevelt's vice president on that last go around, which, as we know, would have made him president when FDR passed away. So I was fascinated to know that the gentleman who had founded one of the larger ag companies was also extremely involved in shaping agriculture policies as we know it, getting us out of the Great Depression, leading us through a world war, and had a chance to basically be one of the United States presidents, perhaps be even more influential, but just didn't quite make that upper crust of American history. But when you look down a little further, he was involved in a lot, and some of his political ideology and thinking was unique, perhaps a little socialistic, and we can see some of its themes and key causes ringing true in American life today. So, yeah, I think Vice President Henry Wallace might be the highest distinguished term that we would address him as, Vice President or Secretary Wallace. Did anybody else have other highlighting tidbits? We have a hand raised, Mr. Schaefer.
Yeah. Connecting kind of the ideas of agriculture and his sort of socialist policy, I was pretty intrigued most specifically by what he called or what academics call the ever normal granary plan. I'd be interested, especially Landon, in your opinion on this, where it was basically a very much government managed approach to agriculture. When crop production was too high, government would purchase crop products. When production or how yeah. Did you read this, Landon? So I'm not stepping all over myself. The ever normal granary plan.
Yeah, I think what had occurred, I think we were in a period of overproduction, certainly in hogs, maybe in crops, and to reset the scales, I think part of basically the first farm bill as we know it came out in 1933, completely the brainchild and almost exclusively written, word for word, by Henry Wallace. I don't think I know all of the weeds, nor do we want to get into the weeds of farm policy. It's kind of boring. But what happened, I think they paid farm to farm in some places. They even slaughtered a lot of hogs just because there were too many at the time. And what it came to be is, any society's um, ongoing concern, or the first problem a society has to address, is like, how are we going to feed ourselves? And when the food supply disappears, there is almost no more structure to society. And so that came to be a bit of a problem through the Great Depression, and we had to solve for that first. And so what he basically, in some ways, dare I say, socialized agriculture in how how much production was tracked, how much supply was managed, how prices were incentivized or subsidized, and made much of the need to worry about where our food comes from or agriculture in general kind of an afterthought because we eliminated some of the going concern.
I'm sort of intrigued by this. So oftentimes I know this sort of departs a little bit from the speech a little bit, but still on the topic of Wallace. This so oftentimes people who make these kinds of government control policies, they tend to be liberals who are just not as closely connected to the farm. Obviously, in Wallace's case, he was proposing, he was acting on these kinds of policies, but he was someone who deeply understood agriculture.
Yeah.
Even this professor of agronomy's belief that the most aesthetically pleasing corn produced the greatest yield. Yeah, so I don't know, just that idea interests me, and that can open up a whole nother can of worms regarding a different topic. But yeah, I mean, we're just kind of filling out the idea here of this Renaissance man, someone deeply understood things that were just on complete opposite ends of the spectrum in many ways.
Ross, do you have a thought?
Honestly, on the agriculture stuff, I feel like I didn't go quite as deep as Mike, it sounded like. So I don't feel like I have as much to add there.
Yeah.
Kind of the complexity of the figure to just kind of add to what we're saying before we dive too much into the speech that we talked about. Just, I kind of also, I mean, in some ways, like Mike said, kind of opposite ends of the spectrum, kind of some liberal policies, but then very imbued and like identified with agriculture, which today in a politician, I feel like you don't see those two types of things. But then kind of a third one, he just had some interesting, I guess I didn't dive too deep, but just almost religious thoughts as well. He kind of had some correspondences with some interesting figures, dabbled in different things, and just not your typical, again, if we're holding up most of our presidents kind of, right, they kind of stuck to their mainstream thoughts that maybe agreed with other people. And he seems to be, I guess, a little bit different on that aspect as well. Just a couple things. And again, I didn't dive too deep, but I mean, you hear things like he had at one point he was attending meetings of the Pantheistic Theosophical Society. He left the liberal Catholic Church, which he helped found, to join an Episcopal church. Later said he dabbled in mysticism, had a correspondence with some kind of weird Russian-sounding guy. Just some, I don't know, just kind of some interesting, not off the beaten path thoughts on that type of thing as well, just to kind of blend with the other things that make him somewhat of a complex individual, as Matt said.
Great thoughts, Ross. He also gave a speech, Landon. Should we direct our attention to the speech, kind of bring us back to his legacy, which makes us talk about him here?
Absolutely. Yeah. So the speech, it is titled "The Century of the Common Man," and I knew Henry Wallace to have he was a prolific writer. I think it must be said before I jump into this, just how much he wrote. His grandfather and his father owned one of the primary ag publications in Iowa at the time. It still exists today in a couple different forms, but it was called Wallace's Farmer. Huge circulation. It was essentially a way that a lot of Midwest America got their news, got their studies, learned about how to be better corn, soy, hog farmers. And so as soon as Wallace got done with Iowa State, he went to go work for his grandfather's publishing company. So, he was a writer for that and also used some of those things Mike was talking about, calculus. He essentially, there's a little bit of credit, he almost single-handedly invented the study of agriculture economics and applying some of the mainline economic theory and statistics to getting essentially a cohort of people around the country to build those principles out in agricultural markets. So when he came to Roosevelt. Roosevelt knew him as a brilliant mind and needed help to fix and, guide a lot of rural America and fix the food and grain markets. And so um, Wallace was perfectly suited for that. He obviously rose and became vice president in 41 and was tapped to essentially be part of the message to get America involved in the war and to be behind it. And that is the setting for this speech. Roosevelt sent him to South America a lot and tried to basically drum up support in what happened in New York for the speech. It is actually early in the war. I thought it was later, May of 1942. So the war hasn't ended, and much of this is to kind of find a just cause for World War II. I think coming out of the war, Wallace was looking towards, how to make for peaceful transitions and other things. But the setting here is a little bit earlier in World War II. The room is full with people from all over the world. I think 40 different national leaders were in New York at this time, and Wallace was sent to send a message. So, a century of the common man, a few excerpts from the speech. As we begin the final stages of this fight to the death between the free world and the slave world, it is worthwhile to refresh our minds about the march of freedom for the common man. The idea of freedom, the freedom that we in the United States know and love so well, is derived from the Bible, with its extraordinary emphasis on the dignity of the individual. Democracy is the only true political expression of Christianity. The prophets of the Old Testament were the first to preach social justice, but that which was sensed by the prophets many centuries before Christ was not given complete and powerful political expression until our nation here in the United States was formed as a federal union a century and a half ago. Even then, the march of the common people had just begun. Most of them did not yet know how to read and write. There were no public schools. Men and women cannot be really free until they have plenty to eat and time and ability to read and think and talk things over. Some have spoken of the American century. I say that century on which we are entering, the century that will come after being in this war, can and must be the century of the common man. Perhaps it will be America's opportunity to support the freedoms and duties by which the common man must live. Everywhere, the common man must learn to build his own industries with his own hands in practical fashion. Everywhere, the common man must learn to increase his productivity so that he and his children can eventually pay to the world community all that they have received. No nation will have the God-given right to exploit other nations. Older nations will have the privilege to help younger nations get started on the path to industrialization. But there must be neither military nor economic imperialism. And I will stop there. 2 paragraphs from a couple different parts of the speech that I thought were kind of highlight the ethos of Wallace.
So, why does this speech matter, Landon? Why did this speech stick out to you? Why did you pick this speech?
Yep, I think the reason I picked this speech, this was probably the one phrase, the century of the common man, that was most attributed to Wallace. This speech, given the first time that he gave the speech, he gave different versions of it and was pretty good at stumping around this message. What it evolved into over the years was, and I say over the years, probably the next 3 years, is there became a fear of, post World War II, of what roles Russia would play in some of the redevelopment, and there was probably a key feeling that as soon as we defeated the Germans, should we go on to Moscow? Should we snuff out communism? It's not that much better than Nazism. And that existed in several forms, obviously, over the next couple decades as we fought other wars. And Wallace could already see, this speech doesn't show that, but in Wallace's history, he could already see that that was the case, that last sentence I just read, there must be neither military nor economic imperialism. There was going to be a want to keep the war engine running, to find the next enemy, to keep that part of it up. And he very much was like, let their policies, it can be a test. Maybe they should let communism run its course, and we will prove that capitalism and democracy is the best God-given form for the individual common man. And he did not want to go fight wars. That verbiage that he had ended up, he was ousted essentially from the nod to continue under Roosevelt's VP and replaced with Truman in 1945. And so back then, VPs were still elected separately. And at the party convention, Wallace was basically subbed out for something a little, Truman wasn't quite as a known figure at the time, but more easily, perhaps would get in line or not ruffle so many feathers on some of this more grander, visionary, perhaps a little socialistic ideas that Wallace had. So I think that interesting point of who Wallace was and how he might have affected post-war America, I think this speech points to his background.
Yeah, I think what's sort of striking to me about his ethos, if you will, is how, it's not like he was apathetic towards communism or that he was a socialist. He was obviously different from Bernie Sanders in the fact that Bernie Sanders is a socialist. Wallace was not a socialist.
Right.
But he simply believed that the best way to resolve this die on, which, I think one can argue, it sort of has, right? Obviously there is no more Soviet Union. Is Russia a world power? Yes and no, I suppose, is the most accurate answer. And, it's an interesting sort of thought experiment. What if we had this sort of mindset applied towards Islamic extremism, or this can sort of, but just taking ourselves back to 2003, 2001 era, where President Bush wanted to take us to the Middle East for war. Regardless momentarily of the rightness or wrongness of that, I don't know, how would things be different if we had this attitude of more, it will die out on its own. So just an interesting approach that you don't necessarily hear articulated a lot. Everything has to be very aggressive, it seems like, or else what are you doing? But yeah.
So yeah, I want to jump off what Mike just said a little bit. So real quick before I get into it, I think part of why the speech, he set it up from the very beginning, right? We said, this is during the war. So, right, in some sense, it's like we're going to talk more about him not wanting to maybe be as involved in what would be the Cold War and things like that. But it's not like the dude was a straight up pacifist or anything, right? He's given this speech to not drum up support necessarily, but sort of, I think, drum up support for a war. So it's not like he's like some, weird figure, pacifist, let's not ever fight any wars. That's not him either. No. And then he even starts his speech, or I'm sorry, the segment you chose started with, right? He sets it up as the free world versus the slave world. So, very much almost like these are the good guys, these are the bad guys type thing. So it's not like he's a pacifist, and he is, I mean, in some ways, this speech makes it clear what we should be involved right now. And yet, like you said, at the end, he definitely got his maybe points across, right? That being against imperialism, and then Mike, you brought up in the thought experiment, like, what if we just let this die out? There was a quote that I found interesting that kind of, I mean, pretty much played this very, I mean, this doesn't play the thought experiment, but we have two differing opinions on Wallace. So this is from The Untold History of the United States, okay? And Oliver Stone argues that had Wallace become president in 1945, which, like Landon said at the beginning, was, I mean, not that far from happening, quote, there might have been no atomic bombings, no nuclear arms race, and no Cold War, end quote. So it's like, okay, that sounds pretty nice. Maybe we should have had Wallace become president and just let it die out. Contrast, Ron Capshaw of the Conservative National Review argues that a President Wallace would have practiced a policy of appeasement that would have allowed the spread of communism into countries like Iran, Greece, and Italy. So pretty much, the other viewpoint that, yeah, he's pretty much practicing appeasement, and then we have similar things to what we saw way back in the beginning of this World War II segment, right, when Churchill was the only voice arguing we should fight for Stalin, where the powers that be, or we should fight, Hitler, where the powers that be had more of the, oh no, like let's let him be, we don't want to fight a war, and then obviously it led to almost Hitler taking over Europe. So, yeah, I think those are just interesting questions because I feel like it's kind of one of those things that hindsight's usually 20/20, but in the moment that can just be, I mean, I guess it is a hard call, but it just like you said, kind of an interesting thought experiment, I guess at times.
Yeah, and I think that's why I find Wallace so complex. Is that he's not this pacifist. He's not certainly not a socialist, just from like the excerpts that you read, Landon, about democracy being the only true political expression of Christianity. He's very much like for this war against the Germans and emphasizing freedom. And I don't think, and I don't even know that if you were to think about just how things ended up transpiring with Russia and what they ended up doing on their end, obviously it's more complex because there's United States. I don't know if aggression is the right word, but assertion, and certainly this involved United Nations and Great Britain as well. Like they were very concerned about Russia being a world power too. It wasn't like just us who tried to push back against the Russians. But he's just very. Let me take a step back for a second. I think this might have been in the second speech that you posted, Landon, about him kind of with this idea of kind of taking a step back, letting things die out, not being super assertive. But he's, basically said, Russia can, interact with their neighbors and we can interact with our neighbors, and, they can do whatever they want with people in Eastern Europe, and we can kind of interact with our neighbors in Central and Latin America, and, the world will be fine. But like we all know that didn't exactly play out that way. Certainly we had a lot of influence or tried to have a lot more influence in Europe, and they also had quite a bit of influence in Latin America. So like, I don't know that even though his ideals sounded appeasementy or sounded kind of very I don't know, like he was just going to make all these compromises. He also had lines. He did kind of assert himself staunchly against like certain aspects of communism and certain aspects of I don't know, I suppose you can call it like subsidiarity, in that like we're going to work with our neighbors and they're going to work with their neighbors, and we're not going to try to have this imperialistic control over the whole world. At the same time, like if Russia did end up stepping on our toes, if they would have done that under a Wallace presidency, like I don't know that he would have just been a pushover either, because he did have like a very principled stance. So I don't know. I think that's why I'm intrigued by him, because he's a hard guy to pin down. And I think these projections that Ross mentioned, I think those are kind of hard to pin down too, because I can see things kind of breaking down a number of ways.
Correct me if I'm wrong. So obviously the Vietnam War was about not permitting the spreading of communism. The Well, I guess the Korean War was the same thing, yes?
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, so here's another. I've got so many thought experiments tonight.
It's
And
so dang complex.
this also sort of this takes, for those not familiar, the concept of subsidiarity is this idea that what can be governed at the local level can only be governed at the level above that, should be governed by that. It's a very important concept within the Catholic Church's social justice teachings. But what I sort of had this a thought that struck me here is, um, we see the exact same thing taking place, I think, in a successful marriage or dating relationship, especially where, stakes are higher than, just a friendship or something. In a relationship, you can have your beliefs that, well, you should have your beliefs that a given belief system is better than someone else's, right? Because otherwise, why are you believing that? But the way that you bring this person to your belief system is not by imposing it on them as if it is this sterile body of beliefs, not the shell of beliefs. Rather, it's something living, breathing. It's going to be something that needs to be matured into. And I see that same sort of parallel in Wallace's perspective on how to bring the rest of the world into a thriving capitalistic democracy, not through the approach that the United States more or less took, where it was, if we see communism, we're going to spill blood for it, but rather it will die and take these smaller control measures in order to assist. So anyway, I think it's interesting that it might be a little bit easier to see where he's coming from in smaller spaces. And so, it's interesting and maybe provoking at some level to think, oh, well, that maybe should be true at the international level as well.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting thought. And then, I mean, we probably want to get on something else too. I don't think we want to beat a dead horse too much, but just to add to the thought experiment though, like right back at, like, not necessarily to disagree, but just to kind of keep the thought moving. So like you said, it's almost like maybe we should have thought, maybe these wars, like, should we have done this? Maybe we should have let it die out. But like, what if they had taken that same logic to Hitler? Right? That's what a lot of the British did. And so, right, Churchill was, initially, and Churchill was one of the ones who's like, nope, like, kind of like Matt said, like, line drawn too far. Like, we're going, we got to fight this guy. So like, eventually the line has to get drawn, I guess, if somebody is willing to go so far. So kind of like, yeah, let communism die out. But I mean, like, look at the Soviet Union. I mean, communism doesn't just die out immediately. I mean, tons of people are going to die and go through bad things, so it's not like so simple as just, oh yeah, it's this bad idea. They'll learn better. It's like, well, a lot of people's lives are going to be impacted by, letting this play out. So, yeah, anyway.
And that's why I like the complexity, because like and I don't know how much was known worldwide at the time in terms of what was, just the degree of like oppression and genocide and whatnot that was going on in communist regimes. I mean, like, total estimates, like, it's hard to estimate just because there's, a lot of unofficial record keeping, whatever. I mean, looking on Wikipedia, they cite probably 10 or so different, kind of studies on the death counts of communism. I think the lowest was 20 million. but that was a kind of an outlier on the low end. Everything else was 70 million and above. Yeah, I
During
don't know.
World War II, or the transition from some of these monarchy societies directly to communism, like Russia or China, kind
I
of.
would say so. This is more the latter. So this is not like what was done up to World War II. This is kind of like, yeah, and part of the problem with a lot of these uh, death counts or death totals is that some include all of Russia and exclude everything else. Some include Russia and China. Some include
Yeah.
a variety of different things. So there's not really an established means of calculating that. But regardless, whether you're talking 20 million or 100 million, like it's still a pretty, there's certainly a human rights issue that I would say is comparable to the Nazis. I know it's a little bit more diffuse. It's not quite as um, like this really profound articulation of like a genocide like the Nazis had. Like it's definitely different, but certainly, certainly alarming, certainly disturbing, and like the type of thing that, again, I don't know how much was known at the time, um, but yeah, certainly the type of thing I could see with more knowledge and with more exposure, that being the type of thing that a guy like even like Henry Wallace would sort of would realize or have, I don't know, not like he didn't realize there were issues there, but perhaps have like just changed the equation for a guy like Wallace. Um, but yeah, I mean, he's definitely, I do like the approach, and I like what you said earlier, Mike, about the kind of taking subsidiarity on an international level and kind of the idea of that being and kind of trusting ourselves, to kind of like, we don't need to confront them directly. Like we can trust that, if we believe what we say we believe and we believe that's a good thing, that's going to win out. But at the same time, like those ideals, if they're getting, if they're just being abused and there's people worldwide, like, I don't know, they're just as Henry Wallace was very, forward about our need to confront the Nazis. I could see potentially there being a change in the equation for him in some means of, or him being open to some means of confronting the Soviets.
Yeah. And he does do that. I will, to wrap up kind of the primary part of his biography, he was a team sport. Truman got the VP. FDR passed away. And Wallace took on the Secretary of Commerce, was still, a very influential, top cabinet member for Truman, but had his tendencies to go and speak his mind. And he gave a speech that ended up being published. It got back to Truman later. Here's the last paragraph of it. Russian ideas of socio-economic justice are going to govern nearly a third of the world. Our ideas of free enterprise democracy will govern much of the rest. The two ideas will endeavor to prove which can deliver the most satisfaction to the common man in their respective areas of political dominance. Under friendly, peaceful competition, the Russian world and the American world will gradually become more alike. The Russians will be forced to grant more and more of the personal freedoms, and we shall become more and more absorbed with the problems of social economic justice.
I love
Yeah, go for it, Mike. Go for it.
I love that line. I love it because it's so realistic. It makes sense. It's so positive. Um, gosh, oh man, yeah, I think we should connect
You
that.
kind of, yeah.
You know,
So that again, you think we should what? You think we should what?
I'll just restart here. So I love this sentence from Wallace here. that this idea that the Russians and us are going to sort of kind of meet in the middle to some extent. And what I like about that is because it's so positive, it's so realistic, and you know, I think it is important to connect things to current events to some extent. I was watching before this debate between President Obama and Senator Romney when they were running against each other, and I saw their very diplomatic and respectful dialogue, and I thought too, of course, President Trump and Vice President Biden's debate, of course, that was infamous recently. The point here is that it's just so striking, the refreshing positivity and realism to all. Gosh, I don't know. I'm not going to overextend my thought any more on that, but it was just simply saying this, man, gosh, if only we had more of this realistic optimism in political offices these days. Oh, man. Even thinking to the videos that I was watching on President Truman in preparation for this, like, this is sort of a meta question, and I'll cut myself off after this comment, but it's like, golly, why do more positive realism, I'll call it, today in politics? Like, what is it that makes people like Vice President Wallace so rare? I say rare. They definitely exist. I can think of a few politicians who have that demeanor. But why is it so rare? Why do we not see it in more political leaders today?
That's a big question.
What do you guys think about that? The idea of positive realism. Do you get where I'm coming from, where Wallace is coming from?
Yeah, I think that if I first found out about a couple of facts about him, but then I think his attitude towards solving problems and looking at the world and he didn't fit into any boxes. I think he switched parties like 5 times. He made new parties when he got fed up the old ones, and his focus more on, essentially what the title of this speech is, like, build a society for the common man. That if that's the goal, like, is it capitalism? Is it communism? Is it socialism? Like, I don't know, it could be a little bit from a couple of those and mostly democracy and capitalism. But he started with, kind of the end result and intended to typically focus on that rather than the ideology itself. And I think that sounds like an intriguing vision. It's more specific than just grand of, you know, language or whatever. And so I think that's why he's appealing. I'm not sure in smaller sound bites and a whole host of reasons for the last couple decades why we don't see that more.
I mean, I think part of it, like the appeal that we're talking about, is just that, like, it seems very genuine when he's saying it, right? Because kind of like Landon said, I mean, he switched parties. He was so close to the top, got knocked down, but then was right there, like you said, like back in when Truman was president. So it does seem like there is some sense of just, yeah, he genuinely, like, he was obviously an intelligent guy. He was articulate, and like he genuinely thought these things would be the best, the best course of action. So he was not afraid to say them, right? Even to the point where it got him, right, not put on the vice president ticket for Roosevelt's last term. So I think that is kind of unique. I don't want to bash politicians because that's not what we're here to do. And like Mike said, there's several of them that probably are good, but I think that is, to be totally honest, somewhat unique. Just people being so willing to just be genuine. Like, this is what I think, and I think it's the best thing. And so I'm not afraid to say it, even if it, as opposed to just people saying whatever they need to say to get elected. He, said that thing that literally took him away from possibly being president. So that is somewhat, encouraging.
I'm gonna try really hard to bridge two parts of Wallace's speech and bring them in to current events. Right.
I
One
think we
of the
can
other
and we should. Yep, go
the
for it.
other
Let's hear it.
that struck me, one of the pieces of the speech which struck me that we have not talked about was a line. Let me do my control find real quick so I can go back to
And
where
while
it
you're
was
doing
at.
that, for the fans, I haven't seen Mike this excited in like 6 months.
Here's the line that struck me. He said, "Men and women cannot be really free until they have plenty to eat and time and ability to stay things over." And what I put in the reply or comment section alongside that text was the Latin abbreviation for reference. Internet, question mark, question mark, question mark. Does the internet liberate or enslave? Now, of course, it liberates and enslaves. I'm not going to be an utter extremist like I'm criticizing here, but connecting it to this idea of the positive
Connect.
realism, we can, I think, I'm just putting this out there, when we operate in certain spaces of the internet, we can come to believe that the world is defined by more lines than it actually is. More lines between good and evil people, right? And good and evil policies. When reality it's obviously not that way. Well, I don't think it is. It's in reality this constant tension between good exists, but exists inside of every one of us, not inside of one group of people versus another group of people. And I think what the internet maybe does is it sort of like smothers this positive realism, right? Because a positive realism that Vice President Wallace brings to the table and a few other politicians is this idea that good and evil can become very blurred, right? Maybe the best way to reduce abortions is not by strictly voting for quote unquote pro-life president, but rather someone whose policies have evidence to actually reduce abortions, even though that's surprising. I have more on that if you guys want to explore that. But anyway, again, I'll stop talking. You guys picking up anything I'm throwing down? A little more explanation? Where are we at?
Yeah, so I think the last part I heard, you talked about the internet, but then switched to, how would I rephrase it? Yeah, it was focusing on the end result rather than the theories that may or may not get to the end result.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's an accurate.
Which to pull out something way far back here, and our listeners probably don't even know this, because before the podcast was a real thing, we actually did a pilot episode, a secret episode, if you will. And I can't quote it, but I believe Teddy Roosevelt himself, in a speech given post-presidency in Paris, pretty much said the same thing, that we need to stop being so concerned with, if somebody presents a good idea, it's a good idea. And it doesn't necessarily have to be who said it, how they got there, that type of thing. Like if somebody presents a good idea, whether they disagree with you on other things or whether even, that's still a good idea. So you can support that. And not that it's the exact same thing that Mike was saying, but it kind of made me think of that a little bit, like kind of this positive realism, I guess.
We can edit this out if need be, but to keep sort of like just exploring this concept of freedom that he presents, because I don't know about you guys, but just the way that he says it's just so dead on what real freedom is, these sort of base freedoms here. And it prompts me to just think a little bit more critically about what real freedom is and how our freedoms are actually being infringed on, right? I mean, we obviously operate, for those who are listening to this podcast in the year 2030 or and beyond, we're in a pandemic right now. Some of the common conversations you might hear in the word freedom coming up are things like, freedom to not wear a mask, or freedom, to do these other things pertaining to the pandemic, right?
Those are things that you hear. Oh,
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for approving that, right? But are those the real stakes for our freedom, or are they not, like the way that the internet is infringing our ability to read and talk things over, right? Yeah, so I'll cut myself off there, but it's just this interesting idea.
I'm really glad that you're bringing up the internet, and I feel like we've pooped on the internet in a few different podcasts. I know there's Eric Snowden one, we talked about some of the issues with that being enslaving, but gosh, like, yeah, I mean, I really do. I really do think that well, not even just that medium. I would say even just cable news, or just the short attention span and the ability for just the American public to spend more than like 60 characters worth of attention to different things, um, is, yeah, I think that is a fundamentally problematic issue that does not allow for people like Henry Wallace, or whatever whatever you want to call it, the positive realism, or whatever. It doesn't allow presidential candidates um, who are just thoughtful, realistic people. I mean, Andrew Yang is someone who stands out as like that sort of person who's very interested in the end result and is very open to like a variety of means of getting there. Like, he's not opposed to cutting taxes potentially, if that's something, or he wouldn't be opposed to, like, or he doesn't seem to be that way. I don't know his exact policies on that sort of thing. But then he's also like, well, shoot, why don't we try this universal basic income thing? Like this, mathematically, it seems like it might work out, blah, blah, blah. But he's very willing to have conversations about like how to do it, not just let's do this ideological thing. But yeah, I mean, I would say more than just the internet, and perhaps the internet's contributed to this, but perhaps just a lack of attention span has led to the popularity and expansion of the internet. But either way, I would say more precisely than the internet per se, because I mean, like Mike, you mentioned earlier, it liberates us, and it liberates us as well as enslaves us. I think our just attention span needs to get better, and our ability to suspend our judgment needs to get better to really improve those sorts of conversations, and to allow people with some sort of more thoughtful, realistic, positive message to come through.
yeah, that's cool thoughts on the positive realism. I have two other things too, real quick. So things we haven't really talked about. So right, Landon, I think you mentioned earlier in your kind of the quick bio on Wallace. So, he was kind of ahead in his time, like on like some social issues, right? Like racial justice, or maybe Mike mentioned it, some women's working rights, things like that. Um, what policy did he advocate for policies? I mean, I read that as well, but I didn't get into like the specifics. Like, what was he about for those things that he's remembered for?
I do not know off the top of my head. Let me see if I can look at one note. But yeah, he does throw out that term several times in two of his speeches.
I mean, I read that like he was about,
Yeah.
I think, women's working rights, something with social justice with, for like African Americans, kind of the more liberal side of things, like we said earlier, in a way. But I just didn't get into specifics. Like, did he advocate for policies, or like what exactly did that mean?
Yeah, he never. So I think what's hard with Wallace and his political background is that he never ran for anything. So he was a bureaucrat, essentially. You know, Roosevelt appointed him to Secretary of Ag. He would have had to, I guess, been elected in 41 for VP. That wasn't, I don't think, as much of a public vetting platform process as it would be today. And then he kind of retired into civil life. So as I like kind of quickly scroll through some of his biographical notes, his policy positions on everything like aren't super clear. I think given the title of the speech and what he's known for, like so social justice and the common man, regardless of race, ensuring that the political system is designed such that it, um, benefits the most for the most good at the most times, I think was his, general thesis, or, you know, say for like going to war, and war really doesn't help anyone. So I think it'd be mostly focused on the common man. With that, we talked a bit about him, um, and what he stood for. And as we wrap up some of our, the ugliest war of the century, maybe of the last couple centuries, we were trying to evoke some hope and inspiration for coming out of this great bloody battle involving nearly all nations of the world. Did we, and perhaps not did we, but what was the biggest how? Or if we fell short, you could say that too. But Henry Wallace, kind of uh, had the most precise vocabulary for what to do with all of this newfound power and influence that he knew America was going to quickly have, or perhaps already did. And his proposal was to make it the century of the common man. If Henry were on this podcast, and we're a decade or two away from it being a century, how would he measure the progress? Has it been the century of a common man? In what ways have we lived up to it, or of highlight to you, or in what ways have we much to improve?
I think we have lived up to it well. Um, Simply, I don't think we are perfect. I don't think that there's not still progress to be made. But if you look at life for humans, like in the U.S. today, compared to what they were at the time, I think you'd have a hard time saying it's not better in most ways. So I would say we're not perfect, but I think we've lived up to it well.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd have to agree. I mean, I think I sort of take a stand back approach to Ross. Remember, we're not fighting against in our own personal growth against our neighbor down the street with a $500,000 house. We're fighting against being basically wild baboons in the forest, right? I mean, that's a realistic situation that humans lived in for, I don't know, like 300,000 years. That's what we're fighting against, and that is what uh, government society has provided for us in many ways with so little work on our part, an almost embarrassingly small amount of work. Um, My girlfriend Maggie and I, we started doing this exercise from the ARF mailing list. There's our Brett McKay toss out there. That's 16 straight episodes. We wanted to keep that streak going. We ask ourselves 3 questions every single night. We've been doing it the past week or so. What did you receive today? What did you give today? And what problems or suffering did you cause today? And what we received is so insanely long of a list every single day because it is so easy to live in the United States versus as a baboon in the forest. I mean that's a silly way of putting it, but I mean it's serious at the same time. So in this very long, drawn out way, yes, it's not easy being a common man or common woman. But I think that the United States has done a pretty good job compared to the alternative.
To just jump off your thought, to connect it to a thought we had earlier before Matt gives his answer, I think that's one of the things you said, what makes Wallace so appealing. And like I kind of said, he's very genuine, but that's one of the things I dislike most about listening to sometimes politicians speak is they think the only way they can get their point across is by telling you how bad it is with someone else's policies. But I usually look at it like, but you're like, compare my life or anybody's life in the U.S. right now to anybody's else. I mean, outside of like a king in France in 1500, like compare that to anyone else's life in the last 1,000 years. And it's better on every front. They have a house, they have an iPhone. And yes, I'm not saying poverty doesn't exist. I'm not trying to argue that we're perfect, but that it seems to be that idea of, oh, it's so bad because of this person's policies. It's like, well, things are still pretty darn good. So, to kind of, but ode to Wallace here, seeming to speak his mind on why he thought his policies were best, I think was a more effective approach.
I'm going to echo you guys a fair amount. Because even beyond the baboons in the forest comparison, let's just look at the 1940s when he was giving this speech. There was, medically, like people were dying of polio and a bunch of other stuff, right? There was no polio vaccine yet. I don't think that was the 50s. Is that right? I don't know if my history is exactly right on that. But if there was a polio vaccine, certainly wasn't widely distributed, and there probably wasn't the whole other arsenal of vaccines and much beyond vaccine, just the medical things that we have at our disposal. Just as like one more specific instantiation of that sort of thing. The only way I would say we failed, or maybe not the only, definitely not the only way, perhaps a substantial way we failed, I would say just to emphasize a few things that came up earlier, just with our, I phrased it as like the lack of attention span. I do feel like the thoughtful soul, and perhaps this is a false nostalgia for a time that never existed. Maybe everyone was just as kind of immediate and thoughtless as they are nowadays, that you just weren't there to experience it. But yeah, I do think that there is something kind of toxic about the immediacy with which we digest, not even digest, just consume and then spit out media and data and things that I think does kind of suck the soul out of things. So I would say in that way we've perhaps failed to live up to the century of the common man.
Nice. I would say if Henry were sitting here, Vice President Wallace, I think it would look far different if we were reviewing the major milestones of the decade that made the history books. I'm not sure it would line up with exactly maybe the way he thought it different points would look. Not a good or a bad thing. I think what he envisioned and how things unfolded, we did get into wars. We, a war every other decade or a little more. But to use an example of today, 2020, we've had a trade war, we're calling China's hand and, making sure they're doing business ethically, treating their people better and on the condition that we'll sell corn to them or whatnot. And I think, there's an entire, almost mercantile country, 1 billion people who in the last 30 years, whose standard of living has, skyrocketed. Many tens of percentage points have come to the farm, to the city, and are not impoverished anymore. All, between the Western world, perhaps the United States leading it, buying their stuff, and our commercialism and capitalism is driving, the benefit of other nations. And I think that he was right. I think capitalistic democracy has its tools and ways to bring people up, and I think sometimes the nuance of how that works and how it's if standard of living and people's comfort and their ability to read and write and think and talk and do that with a phone, with books. I think more people do that today or have the chance of doing that today than in 1940 by a significant amount. And yeah, I think the common man has achieved a lot. So that's Henry Wallace. Any final thoughts?
I got one quick final thought. Sorry, Landon, before you take us home, if that's okay. So just add to the I'm going to do this in quick, but just add to the complexity of Wallace and how even in my own head, my wheels are turning, because 5 minutes ago I was arguing that the common man's doing so well. But one thought I had, kind of jumping off Matt's point, like he commented, like, yeah, we're not perfect, but one area where I think we've failed maybe, I'm going to give a quick shout out to a friend of a couple of ours. His name's John Zegar. Me and John disagree on a lot of things. We agree on some things. We like to argue about them. But one point that I will say he challenged me on a couple months ago that just kind of stuck with me was, if things are so much better, so kind of thinking, right, he's vice president in the 1940s. So to paint a picture, and I understand that's a stereotype to our fans, but, kind of a time when the typical quote unquote family, right, you have your mom, your dad, they had a bigger family than we do back nowadays, maybe 5, 6 kids. The dad worked, the mom stayed home. That picture, right? The idea of it seems that was a legitimate thing at some point, right? That we kind of had that kind of one income could support a big family kind of thing. And I think in today's world, it seems incredibly daunting to someone, say 20 years old, that, wow, I could have a spouse and 5 kids on just my income and provide effectively. I think that's really hard for a lot of people. And to me, that's kind of a common man, right? So that's, I think, to kind of add to the complexity we've talked about so much. There's a lot of sides to different things, but that is, I think, one area that thought, I guess, has stuck with me a little bit. So, Landon, you can take us home.
Yeah, certainly. I think that Wallace understood the long arc of history and talked about a couple times, like, the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the Latin American, Bolivian, German, Russian. And, there's always, he talks about the long pull of the people fighting for rights, justice, equality, to live in comfort, and like that, yeah, that is not done yet. It is still very much a work in progress, and I think 2020 has shown several signs in places where there's obvious work to do to make more feel like being a common man is like the best thing you can have, because for many people they're not there yet, or they don't feel as satisfied. So great discussion. I really enjoyed this one. I think there's some gems hidden in history, and here at the Great Speech, we're always going to find them and talk through those forgotten to history and the lessons that we can still learn from them today. Until next time.